Welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples, the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 112, The Coronation That Wasn't. So far, we've heard that Vyatautas had one daughter who was married to Vasily of Moscow, and Jogaila also had a daughter, Jadwiga, by Anna of Celje, who his wife had supposedly asked him on her deathbed to marry. This left each of them in a different position. Poland had already established that it could have a queen. Lithuania was still only accepting male rulers. Both men were aging and had this succession on their minds, and the Treaty of Horodło, as we discussed last time, had made provisions that allowed either of them to intervene if the other died first. For a decade they seemed to have finally achieved harmony, but after Constance and Horodło, the relationship cooled again, for several reasons. In 1420, Sigismund of Luxembourg, who had, at Jogaila's initiative, been appointed to mediate with the order, delivered his verdict that Samogitia should be returned to the order upon Vytautas' death. The outcome was a shock. The cousins had thought that Sigismund was on their side. Although the traditional view has been that they remained cooperative, some scholars have argued that the decision marked a new split, after which Vytautas pursued full autonomous control over Lithuania and his own dynastic interests, rather than their common aims. Others admit that Polish and Lithuanian interests were diverging. Vytautas was ready to support the order against Poland in the outstanding border disputes, because he was more interested in what was happening in the east. He saw the death of Vasily I and the enthronement of his grandson Vasily II as an opportunity to return to his old ambition of ruling all Rus. While the Muscovites fought amongst themselves, he launched new campaigns against Pskov and Novgorod. Jogaila supported him and sent Polish troops. In the west, there was another opportunity to undermine support for the order. The Council of Constance had condemned Jan Hus for heresy and executed him, despite him having travelled to the council under a safe conduct issued by Sigismund. Then, King Wenzel of Bohemia had died in the middle of the rebellion. Sigismund was crowned at the beginning of July, which managed to unite all supporters of the Hussites against him, and he was deposed within a week. The throne of Bohemia then remained empty for 15 years. The Bohemians had already offered the throne to Jogaila before this even happened. His Polish advisors were strongly against the idea, but they allowed him to avoid giving a clear refusal because it put pressure on Sigismund. A second delegation was sent, and this time Jogaila said that he could not respond without consulting Vytautas. Their advisors once again rejected the idea, while at the same time giving hints that the Bohemians should not give up. A third delegation was sent to Jogaila in Lithuania. This time, when he refused, they offered the throne to Vytautas. Vytautas was interested, and he sent his representatives to Bohemia. Meanwhile, Sigismund, trying to block the move, offered Jogaila his daughter in marriage, with Silesia as the dowry. If you'll recall, Poland had lost Silesia to Bohemia, and the Council of Nobles was very keen to recover it. Zawisza the Black was sent to conduct negotiations. Jogaila himself was not at all in favour of the marriage, as he already had someone else in mind. When Zawisza managed to get himself captured by the Hussites, Jogaila, with the support of Vyatautas and the Pope, got married to Sofia Holshanska, known as Sonka. Jogaila was around 70, Sonka was 17. Better, I suppose, than the proposed Sigismund's daughter, who was 11. Sonka became his fourth wife. After Anna of Celia's death a few years earlier, Jogaila had upset pretty much everyone by marrying for love. The bride, Elizabeth Pilecka-Granowska, was a famous beauty, but was at this point a widow in her 40s who had been married 3 times previously. She had been kidnapped and forced into marriage by her first husband, who was murdered shortly after by the man she had actually wanted to marry, but he died soon after they were married. Then she married the Castellan of Naklo, Vincenti the Granowski, who made her rich and gave her 5 children. This was not the background of someone who was going to fulfill the consort's main task of providing Jogaila with a male heir. But, by all accounts, the marriage was a happy one, until Elizabeth died of illness 3 years later. By all accounts, the marriage was a happy one, until Elizabeth died of an illness 3 years later. But his Polish council was opposed to it, and Vytautas was angry that he had not been consulted beforehand, and told Jogaila that the marriage brought the family nothing. Jogaila persuaded Vytautas to accept his decision, but he once again had to threaten to leave Poland and return to Lithuania before the council would agree to accept the match and permit Elizabeth to be crowned. The Bishop of Krakow refused to perform the coronation, so the Archbishop of Lviv had to fill in, and only 3 of the nobles turned up to the ceremony. Długosz, who was as opposed to the marriage as anyone else, wrote that the court and the whole country rejoiced at her funeral more than her coronation. The new marriage was also controversial. Plenty of people came to the wedding, reflecting Jogaila's increasing international importance. Sigismund of Luxembourg, Eric, King of Denmark, Norway and Sweden, Cardinal Placenta Branda de Castiglione, representing the Pope, an ambassador from the Byzantine Empire, and all the most important Polish magnates were there, along with the Comtors of Elbing and Thorn, representing the Grand Master of the Order. However, Długosz mocks the decrepit Jogaila marrying a young girl with better looks than manners, raised orthodox, and with no dowry. Vytautas did not attend. This is rather strange, since it was his idea to propose marrying Sonka as a way out of Sigismund's proposal to marry his daughter. Historians have speculated that he intended the young Sonka to be his tool in Jogaila's court, and was then unhappy when it turned out that she had a mind of her own. True or not, it's another exhibit in the narrative that the relationship with Jogaila was breaking down. Despite their attendance, his Polish nobles were also not fans of the marriage. They didn't like Sonka being a Ruthenian who had only converted to Catholicism for the marriage, and they didn't like her being one of his subjects, which meant that the marriage did not bring any new gains. They had proposed a different Sophia, the widow of Sigismund's brother Wenzel, but she was considerably older, and this time Jogaila's main objective was to have a son. The plan worked. On 31st of October, 1424, Sonka gave birth to a son named Vladislav. A second son died in infancy, but another, Casimir, followed in 1427. Jogaila's age did raise suspicions that the children were not his. In 1427, accusations were presented against 7 alleged lovers, who were either arrested or fled abroad. Długosz blames Vyatautas for the accusations, although he publicly supported her denials, as did the Bishop of Krakow. The allegations were dropped, although they reappeared from time to time. While all this was going on, Vytautas' foray into Bohemia had come to nothing, with the Hussites forcing his men to withdraw. The Hussites had some support in Poland and weakened Sigismund, so Vytautas and Jogaila did not have enough reason to continue to oppose them. If the interests of Poland and Lithuania were diverging, the personal interests of Jogaila and Vytautas still had a lot in common. However independent or capable Sonka might be, if Jogaila died, she was a young woman with small children and few friends. Jogaila was actively promoting his sons as his heirs, but it was not quite a straightforward question. His daughter Jadwiga was the daughter of Polish royalty, while Sonka was a commoner. The Horodwar Agreement did not provide any clear statement that a son should inherit before she did. The decision, when it came, would be made by the community of the realm. Jogaila needed to be sure that Vytautas would support the claim, and when he heard that Sonka had a son, he went straight to Lithuania to consult his cousin, rather than home to congratulate his wife. Vytautas still needed Polish support to pursue his ambitions in the east, so they continued to work together. The Polish council approved Vytautas being made guardian of the children if anything happened to the king, and Jogaila toured the cities of Poland, collecting oaths of loyalty to his sons. As in previous cases, the Polish assemblies saw the king needing something from them as an opportunity to put new conditions on their support. Brześć made their oath of loyalty contingent on Vladislav swearing to uphold all their rights and privileges. If he did not, they would consider themselves free. Jogaila's attempts to get language asserting his son's hereditary right to rule into the oath documentation were unsuccessful. The assemblies claimed that the kings of Poland were elected, while Jogaila insisted that sons had a natural right to follow their fathers. Jogaila was reluctant to give ground because he'd already been caught out a couple of times. In a war with the Order in 1422, the Szlachta had refused to take part in a key battle until they were granted new privileges limiting Jogaila's power. After the birth of his sons, Jogaila did not want to give away any more concessions, and he had Vytautas' full support in this area. In May 1426, Jogaila formally rejected the conditions proposed by Brześć. Zbigniew Olesznicki, representing the town, handed the town's written declaration back to the nobles, who hacked it to pieces with sabres right in front of Jogaila. This Olesznicki was a well-educated noble from a prominent family. Our impression of his conflict with Jogaila is somewhat compromised because he was the sponsor of Długosz, and indeed the one who told him to write his history. If you recall our earlier discussion, Długosz had a rather chauvinistic attitude to Jogaila and Lithuanians in general. For him, Olesnicki embodied patriotic Polish virtue, and this tends to distort his writing. The tussle over succession rights took a sudden twist in January 1429. Jogaila, Vyatautas, and Sigismund had a meeting in Lutsk, which was primarily intended to settle disputes relating to Poland's failure to come to the aid of Hungary, which had been heavily defeated by the advancing Ottomans in June of the previous year. Also present at the meeting were Vasily II of Moscow, Knyaz Boris of Tver, several of the Ruthenian knyazes, a papal legate, the Tatar Khan of Perikop, ambassadors from Byzantium, Scandinavia, and the Order, and leading Polish nobles. After days of negotiations that went nowhere, Sigismund threw out a suggestion that he first made nearly 20 years previously. Vytautas should be crowned King of Lithuania. Vytautas, of course, said that he could not agree unless Jogaila agreed. Sigismund said that he would take care of it. The next day, Sigismund and Vytautas suddenly arrived in Jogaila's bedroom early in the morning, threw everyone else out, and told Jogaila the plan. He said that he would first need to consult his council. According to Długosz, this resulted from Jogaila being persuaded by Sigismund because he wanted to increase the power of Lithuania, and so unexpectedly acquiesced to the request. With the encouragement of Jogaila and Sigismund, Vytautas informed his Lithuanian nobles of the impending coronation. They were delighted. Then Vytautas sent his secretary to inform the Polish council, stating that he had Jogaila's consent. With the announcement made, Vytautas entered the chamber, expecting to hear their agreement. He was sadly disappointed. Olesnicki declared that a decision on such a complex matter could hardly be made quickly, and reminded everyone that Jogaila had promised that Lithuania would be incorporated into Poland and made subject to it. He continued that Vytautas and all the other Lithuanian princes had sworn to this agreement and that it had been renewed at Horodło, where Sigismund had advised the adoption of the Lithuanian nobles by Polish clans. Now, he said, Sigismund was trying to destroy the union and cause war between Poland and Lithuania. Olesnicki was supported by most of the Polish council. Jogaila was forced to withdraw his consent. The nobles left for Poland. The cousins met privately, where Jogaila again confirmed his support in theory, but when he returned to Poland, he was forced to oppose it publicly. Polish historians mostly accept the story told here, which is from Długosz, that the coronation was a ploy of some kind by Sigismund. A few argue that it was Jogaila's idea as a means of putting pressure on the Polish nobles over Władysław's succession. As Vytautas had no sons, Władysław could succeed him as the king of Lithuania as well. The oldest Lithuanian chronicles, which Lithuanian historians usually follow, state that it was Vytautas' idea and that his aim was greater Lithuanian independence. The story given in the chronicles is otherwise poorly supported, though. Other historians, such as Robert Frost, see Długosz's narrative as broadly more plausible. There's enough evidence to suggest that Vytautas genuinely wanted Jogaila's support, and his need for support in the east still remained. However, the idea of a surprised Jogaila, unaware of what's happening and pressured into going along with whatever Sigismund suggested, is rejected. Whatever the backstory actually was, the upshot was that Vytautas had already announced the coronation to the Lithuanians and had then been humiliated by the Polish council after telling him that he had Jogaila's consent. There was no way he could back down without losing face. Jogaila wrote to Sigismund to say that he agreed with his nobles that the plan raised fundamental questions about the relationship between Poland and Lithuania. He asked Sigismund to drop the idea before it caused more conflict or even war. He said that he had only granted his lands to Vytautas for his lifetime and that crowning him would have called that disposal and the rights of Jogaila's heirs into question. This correspondence is usually interpreted as implying that Jogaila had indeed gone along with the scheme to create a bargaining chip in his negotiations with the Szlachta, but that this had backfired, and now he was stuck about what to do with Vytautas. Sigismund decided to make things worse by forwarding a copy of the letter to Vytautas. Vytautas read the letter aloud to an assembly of the Lithuanian boyars. He asked if they wished to be subjects of the Poles and pay them tribute. They declared that they and their ancestors had always been free, had never paid tribute, and never would pay tribute, and that they would defend their ancient liberty. This set out the key issue with absolute clarity. Olesnicki and his Polish party declared that the Lithuanians were subordinate to Poland. The Lithuanians declared that they were not. Vytautas was not declaring independence from Jogaila. The coronation was intended to establish that Lithuania was equal to Poland. Polish and Lithuanian historians have often followed their nationalist narratives, but the more objective among them, as well as foreign historians, have agreed that the union agreements were ambiguous and that a relationship between equal political communities was a valid interpretation. However, it was also possible to read them as giving Jogaila, as King of Poland, supreme authority, which he only delegated to Vytautas. In April 1429, the Poles took their arguments to Nuremberg, tackling Sigismund on his home ground. The delegation told the Reichstag that Sigismund was the elected king of the Romans, not an emperor, and therefore he had no right to create kings. Jogaila, in contrast, was the hereditary ruler of Lithuania. Vytautas was called a lesser prince whose authority depended on Jogaila. This was an interesting approach since the same Polish nobles were trying to deny Jogaila's hereditary rights in Poland. So how could they recognize them in Lithuania if Lithuania was part of Poland and subject to the same laws? The nobles were actually facing a similar conundrum to Jogaila. What if Jogaila died and Vytautas just decided to do whatever he wanted? How would they preserve the union then? The success of the union so far had been based on the cousins' willingness to work together. Jogaila treated Vytautas with respect, took his counsel, and allowed him free rein in Lithuania. insisting on Lithuania being a subordinate province of Poland and driving Vytautas away was the biggest threat to the Union. So, now they switched to negotiations about how a coronation could happen. 3 embassies were sent to Vilnius. They even proposed that Jogaila should step down and Vytautas be crowned King of Poland. Accepting this would have meant going back on everything he had ever done and said, so Vytautas declined. Meanwhile, another delegation persuaded the Pope to side with Poland, which was a big win. But Sigismund promised that he would send Vytautas a crown, and so Vytautas sent out invitations to the coronation. The day came, and Sigismund's embassy had not arrived. The Poles had seized them at the border. Some Lithuanian historians claim that they were carrying a crown, but it's pretty well established that they were not. Sigismund had failed to follow through on his promise. They were, however, carrying documents that showed Sigismund proposed that Vytautas's heirs should succeed him as king, and that there should be an alliance among Lithuania, Sigismund, and the Order surrounding Poland. And the legal opinion from the University of Vienna that his coronation would be legitimate. This was all quite provocative. Vytautas wrote to the Polish nobles denying that Lithuania was any threat, asserting that he had never done anything detrimental to Poland, and stating unequivocally that he was only acting because Jogaila had broken his promise and he was forced to defend the honor of Lithuania. At this point, the nobles, who, led by Olesnicki, had been implacable in their opposition, realized that they were approaching the point of no return, and agreed to some kind of compromise in Trakai. The details are not known, although there is speculation that they agreed to a papal rather than imperial crown that would be inherited by Jogaila's sons to create a true union. On 16th of October 1430, Jogaila sent Olesnicki back to Poland to ensure the council agreed to the compromise. According to Długosz, the cousins were reconciled. But on 27th of October, before any coronation could happen, Vytautas, who had been growing weaker due to a malignant growth on his back, died. He was around 80 years old, and with his cousin, he had dominated Eastern Europe for 5 decades. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.